Hi folks, and welcome to the first part of our video lesson series on editing. Hope you enjoyed Mad Max Fury Road. We'll get to that in a little bit. Today we're talking about continuity editing, specifically issues of space. But before we get into the definition of continuity editing, I just want to begin with an example of continuity editing, or at least a little bit of that example. I'm going to show you the opening of David Fincher's film, The Social Network.
Did you know there are more people with genius IQs living in China than there are people of any kind living in the United States?
That can't possibly be true.
It is.
What would account for that?
Well, first, an awful lot of people live in China, but here's my question. How do you distinguish yourself in a population of people who all got 1,600 on their SATs?
I didn't know they take SATs in China.
They don't. I wasn't talking about China anymore. I was talking about me.
You got a 1,600?
Yes, I could sing in an a cappella group, but I can't
Does that
sing.
mean you actually got nothing
I could
wrong?
row crew or invent a $25 PC.
Or you get into a final club?
Or I get into a final club.
You know, from a woman's perspective, sometimes not singing in an a cappella group is a good thing.
This is serious.
On the other hand, I do like guys who row crew.
Well, I can't do that.
I was kidding.
Yes, I got nothing wrong on the test.
Have you ever tried
I'm trying right now.
to row crew?
To get into a final club. To row crew. No, are you like, whatever, delusional?
Maybe it's just sometimes you say two things at once. I'm not sure which one I'm supposed to be aiming at.
But you've seen guys who row crew, right?
No.
Okay, well, they're bigger than me. They're world-class athletes. And a second ago, you said you like guys who row crew, so I assumed you had met one.
I guess it just meant I like the idea of it. You know, the way a girl likes cowboys.
Okay.
Should we get something to eat?
Would you like to talk about something else?
Okay, I'm going to stop there. If you want to watch the whole thing, I suggest you check it out on YouTube. I just wanted to show you what a good example of the most basic example of continuity editing looks like. This is a shot reverse shot sequence, and we're referring to a number of techniques that you've already seen within this 1-minute preview throughout this lesson. This whole opening of the film lasts about 5 minutes. And it retains this pace that you've seen throughout. And I just want you to get a sense of what continuity editing does to our visibility of cuts. You may be able to perceive that there's a rapidity, a quickness of this conversation between these two characters, but I doubt that you would be able to count the number of shots that take place within the entire 5-minute sequence. It's 108 shots. Most of them are from about 3 or 4 camera setups. It's very simple, but most of those cuts are more or less invisible to our eyes, and that has to do with what continuity editing is as a technique. So let's go to the basics, the definition. What is continuity editing? It's a style of editing developed in Hollywood in the 1910s, and it became the basis of the classical Hollywood style. The term classical Hollywood is a film that I've already used throughout this course without defining it. But basically, classical Hollywood refers to the structure of Hollywood filmmaking, both financial structure, industrial structure, and aesthetic structures that took place between the 1930s and the 50s. So the style itself began in the silent era. It was picked up by popular narrative cinemas around the world. What is essentially the classical Hollywood style is still very much the dominant mode that you see when you watch big budget films or films around the world today. The idea of continuity editing is to transmit narrative information smoothly and clearly over a series of shots. What are the main principles of continuity editing? Each shot has a continuous relationship with the next shot. What does that mean? It means that cutting is made to be unnoticed or invisible. Not literally invisible, but functionally invisible. The idea that you aren't distracted by the cuts because they conform to your expectations. There's minimal effort for the viewer in following action. There's an emphasis on following human actions. We're going to look at how that manifests itself. We're going to be talking about continuity editing and spatial comprehension. That is spatial as opposed to temporal, which we'll look at in the next video. One of the biggest and most important techniques of spatial comprehension in classical continuity editing is what's known as the 180-degree rule. You may have heard of it, you may have not, but we need you to know what it is. It's the rule that says the camera should stay on one side of the action to ensure consistent left-right spatial relations between elements from shot to shot. The simplest example is when you have two people having a conversation, just like we had in the opening of Social Network. You have your two people, and if you kind of connect an imaginary line across them, that's your axis of action. The 180-degree rule states states that if you're going to shoot these people with a camera from more than one angle, you better keep it on one side of this axis of action. So if you're going to shoot one shot from here, all your other shots better be on this side of the axis. If they're on this side of the axis, what you get is a reversal of screen direction. What does that mean? Well, I'll show you what it means. So once again, let's look at it with the social network example. Here's our two people in the shot. Rooney's on the left, Eisenberg is on the right, Jesse's on the right, and you make sure that when you give a shot from over the shoulder, that Rooney is always on the left side and Jesse is always on the right side. What happens if we break that rule? Well, what happens is that there's going to be something like this, where you get Jesse looking left and then Rooney looking left. And the theory suggests that if this happens, we will become confused and we will no longer have a sense of a spatial relationship between these two characters. So what is the name of the technique that we looked at? The name of the technique, as opposed to the rule that says keep the camera on one side of the axis of action, is shot, reverse, shot. That means two or more shots edited together that alternate characters, typically in a conversation. Characters in one framing look left, the other framing, they look right. Over the shoulder is the name of the camera position, which we talked about in cinematography, that is very common in shot, reverse, shot editing. These are all these interlocked terms, and it's important to know that they're all connected, but that they mean slightly different things. Similarly, the term eyeline match refers to this, when the first shot shows a person looking off in one direction, and the second shows a nearby space containing what they see. Eyeline match suggests that when I see this shot of Jesse Eisenberg, and I see him, say, looking in this direction, I'm going to see who or what he's looking at in the subsequent shot. That's an eyeline match. Now, a point of view shot, which is a term I've already used throughout this class without defining it, but I should do that, is a special kind of eyeline match. A point of view shot is a subjective shot that reproduces a character's optical point of view, often preceded and or followed by shots of the character looking. So this famous example of a point of view shot, and from a famous film that is full of point of view shots, you might say it is the main structuring logic of the film that it uses point of view shots, is both a point of view shot and an example of eyeline match. It is both, but sometimes we have eyeline matches that aren't point of view shots. So just keep in mind, right, that we have these three terms that refer to aspects of this kind of shot construction, but they aren't synonymous. They're connected, but they mean slightly different things. A few more aspects of continuity editing that we've already seen in the opening of the social network. The establishing shot. It's a shot that shows a broad view of where the subsequent action will take place or shows spatial relations among the important figures in a scene. So there's two kinds, basically, of establishing shots. You can call this very, very common example of establishing shots in television shows and in sitcoms, where you see the exterior of a building and then you cut into the interior of the building. That's an establishing shot. But also, this is an establishing shot. When you have a wide view of all three people and then you cut into two people, the first shot is an establishing shot because it establishes the relationships, there are spatial relationships between the figures in the scene. So in the same way, this large two shot, and that's a kind of industrial jargon for what you would call a shot with two people in it, or the two main people, a two shot, is also an establishing shot because it's a wider view of our two characters sitting at the table. What is a match on action? A match on action is a cut that splices two different views of the same action together, making it seem to continue uninterrupted. Many shots in continuity editing in which people or things are moving happen to be match on action shots. This is a good example because it's isolating a very simple action. Humphrey Bogart, as you can see here, stands up, is taking off his jacket, and boom, right in the middle of taking off his jacket, The other shot from the other side continues that movement. And our eyes, instead of seeing the abruptness of the cut, they fixate on the smoothness of the movement. That's why it's such a useful continuity editing technique. It's continuous, it's smooth, it flows, it doesn't interrupt our sense of the important stuff, that is, people talking, doing important things within a narrative. Okay, so this is a good example, right? He's forcing her to the left in one continuous motion, and then as you cut, he is still doing that motion. In fact, notice how our eyes made that smoother than it in fact is. That's because match-on actions rely on our eyes being able to play a trick on us, right? So you can get away with a lot of imperfection in match-on action, but it still makes it a match-on action. A silly example of a match-on action is when you violate the principles of classical Hollywood continuity editing to use the kind of perceptual synthesis of movement to play a little trick, like in this Backstreet Boys video. And you can see this all over the history of film as well. In the same way, avant-garde films like Daisies, which we'll be watching in the next unit, play with the match-on action perceptual synthesis in order to violate a principle of classical continuity editing. The idea is that you're not supposed to allow one person to simply float from one space to another simply by following a movement to the left of the screen. That's exactly what happens here. The match-on action gets our mind to sink into the smoothness of the movement. In a similar way, another film we'll be watching in that next unit, Meshes of the Afternoon by Maya Deren, is doing a similar thing, trying to kind of break the rules by using the rules. In other words, it's using match-on action, but it's having a person step into totally different environments each time. So we have to think of this as some kind of representation of mental space as opposed to physical space. Let's look at a more elaborate but still very, very classical example of continuity editing. It's a little slower. A little more boring, I might say, than Social Network, but it's going to just show us how redundant the classical Hollywood editing principles are. Now, you notice here that we have kind of taken our camera closer to our characters, but we believe that our spectators won't be confused because we've maintained the 180-degree rule. How do I know the 180-degree rule has been maintained? Because I kept the camera largely to the left of these two men. I've maintained that the old guy is looking right and that Humphrey Bogart is looking left. And that's what my brain is telling me, that Humphrey should always be looking screen left.
It was Bernie Olds, the chief inspector, sent word you wanted to see me. Go on, sir. Both pretty and both pretty wild.
Notice there that we've cut in even closer, and we've used that cut in to accentuate a pause.
Both pretty and both pretty wild.
Right there.
What do you want to see me about?
I'm being blackmailed again.
Again? But I know he was a good man at whatever he did.
Now this is the point where I want to slow down and just show you what's happening. Now this has gone on pretty long. You'll notice that the pace is a lot more slower and more deliberate than the Social Network, which takes place in an era in which this kind of pace is not as common. But I want to focus on this moment when they decide to break up the axis of action. They're going to allow Humphrey Bogart to get up from his place, which is to the right of the old man.
I know he was a good man at whatever he did.
He's crossing that axis.
No one was more pleased than I
Now
when
he's
I
to the
heard
left
you
of the
take
old
him on
man as
here
he
as
pours
your-
himself another drink.
Whatever he was.
My friend. My son.
Now, we've essentially reestablished the axis of action. And we've allowed ourselves to cut in because we believe that we now know that Humphrey is to the left, looking right, and the old guy is to the right, looking left. And it just needs to happen that Humphrey needs to have his eyes pointing that way to maintain
Almost.
that 180-degree rule consistency.
Many an hour he sat here with
In other
me,
words,
sweating like a
you
pig.
can break the 180-degree rule by reestablishing the axis of action. That's exactly what's
Drinking the
happening.
brandy I could no longer drink and telling stories of the Irish Revolution.
Well, enough of that.
Yeah.
That's a Gwyn Geiger, rare books.
What we have here is an insert, but it's a special insert that we would call a POV shot. Why? Because we know it's from the point of view, the optical point of view of Humphrey Bogart. That I've seen the action of him taking this card into his hands, and I can intuit, because I'm familiar with the editing system, that it represents his looking, his point of view at this object. So now I'm going to fast forward just a bit to make sure if there's any other moments of interest, to make sure we get our vocabulary down.
It's any man he gets.
For the most part, we're getting shots that continue this axis of action. Humphrey's on the left, Old Gentleman is on the right.
You'll
He's
hear
going to
from
cross the
me.
direction, but at this point, he's not going to reestablish the axis of action. It's just going to reestablish the two-shot and then have him leave. So let's just make sure we have our vocabulary in place. So if I were to ask you, what is this moment a good example of? The answer would likely be match on action. Why? Because there's a very pronounced kind of connection between the movement of Hepburn's arm that motivates the cut to the other side. This is an interesting example. When we get to the shot of the lightsaber moving, that is a good example of an eyeline match. But what's really interesting, of course, about this is that there's no way that he can see this object. He's actually below where it is, even though the logic of editing tells us that there's a connection between him glancing to the right and thus getting this picture. So we have to call it an eyeline match even if he can't literally see it. Now an example from The Shining.
Chopped your wife and daughter up into little bits,
Which world is broken here?
and then you blew your brains out.
With that cut. And that's a trick question in some ways. It's a trick question because on a certain definition of the 180-degree rule, it would break the 180-degree rule. However, I would never test you on a quiz with this question. Why? Because there haven't been enough shots to establish this line as an axis of action. There's only been one shot. So I can't exactly tell you what the axis of action really is, especially when it goes right back to the other angle at that moment. So this is just to say that you need maybe at least 2 shots to establish what the axis of action is before you break it to say whether you've broken the 180-degree rule. Okay, so with that, we'll see you next time for time and continuity editing.